I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to make a bass line out of a beat loop using frequency shifting. In other words, we're going to go from this to this. Now, to find out how that's possible, what we need to do is to open up this magical plugin called the Ringshifter. And what we're going to do in this video is to limit ourselves to looking at the frequency shifting options. And there are two modes for this up in the top left-hand corner. But before we get any further, what I'm actually going to do is to turn off a bunch of things that are happening to produce this effect, and we'll recreate it and find out exactly what's happening. So what I'm going to do immediately is to reduce the envelope follower and the LFO back to 0. We'll find out what those can do in a moment. And what we're going to do, first of all, find out exactly what frequency shifting is. So what I can do with the frequency dial here is to effectively change the frequency footprint of the sounds that I'm working on. Think of this as being the kind of harmonic content for whatever sound you feed into the Ringshifter, and then the capacity to offset that so that effectively you're almost taking the harmonics and you're basically just literally moving them around, either sort of upscaling them or downscaling them to produce, well, all kinds of really interesting effects. Let's find out exactly what we're dealing with when we start moving the frequency dial around. So for a start, without any of the sort of movement we were hearing a little while ago, what I can do if I adjust the frequency dial is literally just shift those frequencies. And that's a lot of fun, even in its own right, just to produce these really interesting little overtones. And obviously, when we get to extremes, we get these really kind of metallic bleeps. But even at sort of low level, what we start to get is this kind of interesting sort of offset of those frequencies. And there's a lot to explore just there by itself. Now, there are two ways that we can use frequency shifting, either in single mode, which we are right now, or in dual mode. And what that does is to produce an equal but opposite secondary shift. So in other words, any shift that I produce upwards will be mirrored downwards. So we effectively get two lots of sort of frequency shifting in polar opposite directions. So if I take this setting here and we listen to the differences between single and dual, you'll hear that there's a kind of stereo effect, but also effectively what we get is this coloration that comes from dual frequency shifting, which we don't get from single frequency shifting. Here's the single version. And it stands to reason that the dual would feel thicker and richer because effectively we've got two lots of frequency shifting happening together. So how did I make my little bass line out of this? Well, the first thing I did was to go and find a frequency that I quite liked in terms of sort of overlaying that on top of the original beat loop. And I think that's back here a little bit. Now what we're getting here is this kind of obvious note that's coming out now from the generation of the kick drum through this frequency shifting process. But how about creating that movement? Okay, so at the heart of the frequency shifter, there's an oscillator stage, which is effectively producing these overtones. And what I can do is to modulate that oscillator, get it moving somehow. And there are a couple of ways in which I can do that. And the first way is to use this LFO. So what I'm going to do is to introduce the LFO, and what that's going to do, this low frequency oscillator, is effectively going to interrupt the oscillator stage of this frequency shifting process. And effectively what that means is I can ask this shape that I've got down here to come and imprint itself on the sound in some way, modulate it and get it moving. Now, the shape that I've selected is clocked to a quarter note. In other words, the rate of this movement is going to repeat itself. This shape is going to happen every quarter note. And what I can do is to play around with both the symmetry of the shape and the smoothness of the shape. So in their default positions, I effectively get a square wave. And what I can do is to start to just offset that, both in terms of the shape itself, but also how smooth it's going to be. Do I want these kind of hard edges that a square wave has, or do I want to smooth those out and produce something which is a little bit more sinuous? I'm going to go for something along these lines. Now, effectively, remember, here I'm contouring the shape and making it the shape I want it to be, and here I'm choosing its speed, and here I'm deciding how much I want to have it interrupt the signal. So I'm going to start at 0 and start introducing it, and what we're going to find is that we're going to start getting variations to the frequency shifting as the LFO works its magic. So at really extreme settings like this, we're getting this massive amount of movement. But back here somewhere, I have my bass line. I've got a very obvious tone that's just sort of moving around just to kind of across a sort of semitone or so. What I can also do is to use an envelope to sort of work on the oscillator as well. Now I can either do this separately, I can take my LFO back down to 0, or I can do this at the same time, introducing an attack and a decay phase, which is just going to sort of modulate that core frequency, both at the initial transient as it's detected via the sensitivity dial, and then at the decay phase as it sort of drops away from that initial, that transient attack becoming the decay phase next. And that's working really nicely, and again at really extreme effects you can hear how the envelope is pushing that frequency shifting up to kind of crazy overtone level. Now there are a couple of other modules here that are worth knowing about. We've actually got a built-in delay line here if we want it again, which again can be tempo synced to the tempo of our project. You can see it's set up here in 16th notes, and then what I've got a chance to do is to control its level in the mix here. Now it's worth remembering that even though I'm kind of using this processor as a means to kind of build a bass line here, obviously there's an entire beat loop passing through this processor, and we can hear that really clearly when we turn the delay up, because suddenly we hear all those little overtones from the other parts of the beat that aren't at the bottom end. I actually don't want any delay on this particular sound, so I'm going to back this down. And you can see that what I've also got a chance to do is to affect the output, literally the volume stage, with both the shape of the LFO and the envelope as well if I want to. So by turning these up, effectively these same shapes are now working on the output stage as well. Lastly, what I've got is this control dial here, which allows me to set a balance between the dry original signal and the processed wet signal. So I can find a balance where I'm happy with the amount of the original beat loop, which is over here on the left, and the processed version, which is over here on the right. By itself, that might be too extreme. Let's have a listen. Okay, so I'm going to go with this balance somewhere in the middle. Now, I've created this kind of bass line, which I like, but I have absolutely no idea which notes I've generated here. My ear is telling me that I like this bass line, but I don't actually know what those notes are. Now, I've set up a bass sound here, which I can play, but that's not actually going to allow me to go and find these notes. What I'm actually going to do is to see whether or not Logic's tuner can help me out. I'm going to go and find that. I'm going to just drop down through the menus here, and in the metering section here, down at the bottom, there's a tuner. Now, obviously, I've put this in after the Ringshifter, because what I'm hoping is that maybe the tuner will have a listen to the output of the Ringshifter, and it will find some notes that maybe will give me some steer as to what these notes are that are being generated by the frequency shift. Okay, so it's wobbling around somewhere between a G and a G sharp, and it sounds like there's a bit of B involved as well. I'm going to put this over here for a moment and just see what those notes sound like when I play them. Well, I don't know about the B, but that does sound like it's involved. Now what it sounds like to me is that I've got those three notes. Now I'm using a combination of the tuner having sort of pointed me in the right direction in my ear then to pick out the notes that at least I'm hearing. Maybe what we can do is to play that bass line in over the top and see how it feels to sort of add a bass line to this groove. And I like the fact that the little skip at the end of the kick drum is being left out of this bass line that I've programmed. So I'm going to quantize that into 16th notes, and I'm also going to fix its dynamics so that there's no velocity sort of changing the way that that bass line sounds. And that's working nicely. So in this video, what we've done is to use Logic's Ringshifter plugin as a frequency shifter, literally taking the harmonic footprint of this beat loop and shifting it away from its original collection of frequencies. And what we've discovered is that when we modulate that using an LFO and the envelope follower to basically just interrupt the amount of frequency shift, we can introduce a kind of tonal footprint on top of a sound, creating a bass line from a beat loop, which we've then been able to detect the pitch of and add our own bass line to follow.